They stepped onto the trail at 9:14 a.m. By 12:30, someone found Melissa's backpack. In the hours, days, and years that followed, no one would ever see either of them again. Not in the mountains, not in the valley, not anywhere. That morning had been the kind people in Pahrump, Nevada, liked to brag about. Thin desert air, sun already sharp but not yet cruel, and a pale haze clinging to the spring mountains like someone had draped gauze over them. The main street was slow, a couple of pickups parked outside the diner, a man in a ball cap hosing dust off his front walk. Rick Campbell, 34, had driven in from Las Vegas before dawn. He'd been hiking since his early 20s, the kind of guy who kept topo maps in his glove box and could name every plant on a trail, but rarely bothered unless someone asked. Melissa Ward, 29, met him in a hiking group years ago. She was quieter, but stronger than she looked, lanky, with a runner's stride, hair usually twisted into a knot under a ball cap. They both preferred trails no one else talked about. Today's route was just that, an unofficial path that broke from the signed trailhead a mile in and wound up through a rocky saddle toward a ridge, with a view no tourist brochure mentioned. No one in town paid much attention when Rick's gray Tacoma eased past the gas station and headed toward the mountains. Melissa's mother, Karen, had seen them off from her porch. Melissa had stayed the night before. It was easier than Rick driving across town to pick her up. While they loaded gear into the truck bed, Karen noticed something strange. Melissa's silver pendant wasn't around her neck. She'd worn it nearly every day since high school. A small oval charm engraved with a single word: Grace. "You're not wearing your necklace," Karen said. Melissa glanced down, touched the bare skin where the chain should have been, and gave a small shrug. Forgot it. Karen didn't press, but the omission clung to her like a splinter. Melissa never forgot it. They stopped for gas 15 miles outside of town. The station was nearly empty, the lot dusty, the air thick with the smell of hot asphalt. Rick went inside for coffee, while Melissa topped off the tank. The camera over pump 3 caught everything. Melissa standing with one hand on the gas nozzle, squinting toward the road. A man in a dark hoodie leaning against a beat-up sedan at the far edge of the lot. He wasn't pumping gas, not checking his tires, just watching. When Rick returned, the man's gaze followed them both until they pulled away. Later, detectives would study those few seconds over and over, zooming the grainy footage until it pixelated into useless blocks. The man never moved, never spoke, but his attention was unmissable. By 9:14, they were at the trailhead. Rick parked on the dirt shoulder beside a faded sign warning about flash floods and rattlesnakes. The air smelled faintly of sage and the metallic tang of dry rock heating in the sun. They shouldered their packs, Melissa's smaller, a bright teal with reflective strips. Rick's heavier, sun-faded from years of use. The first stretch was easy: scrub brush, loose gravel, a gradual incline. They passed a pair of older hikers heading down, exchanged nods, then left the main trail at a cairn Rick had built on a previous trip. After that, the sound of the highway faded, until all they could hear was wind over stone and the crunch of their boots. Somewhere along that narrow ridge, where the path pinched between a sheer drop on one side and a wall of rock on the other, someone saw them for the last time. A birdwatcher from Henderson had been glassing the cliffs for hawks when he noticed a man and woman passing below. They looked steady, unhurried, talking over the wind. He didn't think to wave. At 12:30 p.m., a group of day hikers found a backpack sitting upright against a boulder a mile off the main route. Bright teal. The straps were zipped, no dirt on the fabric. They assumed someone had taken a break and wandered off to look around. But no one returned for it. When a ranger arrived, The details came into focus. It was Melissa's. Inside, snacks, a first aid kit, extra socks, a folded windbreaker. Missing, her phone and her water bottle. The ranger walked a slow circle around the site, scanning for scuff marks, dragged footprints, anything. Nothing. The ground looked untouched. By the time the report reached the sheriff's office, the temperature had dropped a degree, the sun beginning its long fall behind the peaks. And somewhere between that narrow ridge and the lonely boulder, Rick and Melissa had stepped out of sight in a way that would never make sense. Just wondering. Where are you watching from? Write it down, Bello. The search started before dawn the next day. By the time the first helicopter came over the ridge, the dirt parking area at the trailhead was already crowded. Sheriff's trucks, volunteer pickups, a couple of battered Subarus belonging to locals who hiked enough to know the back routes better than most rangers. Folding tables sprouted under an awning piled with clipboards, topo maps, and thermoses of coffee that went cold faster than people could drink it. Deputies handed out radios and orange vests. Dogs arrived in unmarked vans, their handlers in weathered boots and ball caps. The air was cooler than yesterday, a thin wind cutting across the slope, carrying the scent of juniper and dry dust. They started with the obvious. Follow the main trail to where the couple had been last seen, then sweep outward. By mid-morning, the search had grown into overlapping grids. Uniformed deputies, volunteers in hiking gear, and canine units combing through sagebrush and talus slopes. The first odd detail surfaced almost immediately. Melissa's teal pack was logged into evidence, but when officers listed its contents, 2 items were missing: her phone and her water bottle. Everything else was exactly as it should have been. Snacks still sealed, jacket folded, first aid kit untouched. No sign that anything had been torn or dropped in a rush. Deputy Ruiz, leading one of the dog teams, followed a scent from the boulder where the backpack was found. The shepherd tracked confidently along a faint game trail, tail high, nose low. After half a mile, the dog slowed, then stopped abruptly at the edge of a narrow gully. The soil there was darker, looser, like it had been recently disturbed, but the spot was empty. No debris, no tracks leading in or out. Ruiz and his partner dug down a few inches with their hands. Nothing but cold dirt. The dog sat back, silent. Around 4 p.m., 2 hikers from Utah came into the command post with something they thought might matter. They'd been on the upper ridge the day before and, sometime in the late afternoon, heard what they were sure was a woman's voice. Sharp, panicked, carrying over the wind. One said it was a scream, the other called it a shout, but both placed it somewhere near the canyon mouth east of the trail. The detail should have helped, but it didn't. That section of the ridge had already been searched by midday on the day of the disappearance. Volunteers and deputies had been within shouting distance of that canyon and heard nothing. Still, teams were redeployed. The same canyon was swept again, every rock crevice checked, every clump of brush shaken. No trace of Rick or Melissa. No trace of anyone. By the second night, the command post had taken on the rhythm of an exhausted routine. GPS logs downloaded, new grids assigned, drone batteries swapped. The drone footage gave no sign of movement in the search zone, just the long shadows of rock spines and the pale thread of the trail. That's when the call came in. It was close to midnight, most of the searchers either sleeping in their trucks or slumped in camp chairs. The dispatcher patched it straight to the incident commander's phone. A man's voice, low and unhurried, said, "You're looking in the wrong place." The commander asked who it was. The caller hung up. The number showed as blocked. The recording was clean, no background noise, no traceable markers, just those 5 words in a voice no one recognized. It unsettled people in a way they didn't admit out loud. In searches like this, you cling to the idea that the missing are somewhere you haven't looked yet. But the caller's tone was too certain, too final, as if he knew not just where they weren't, but where they were. By morning, the volunteers came back quieter. The K-9 handlers rechecked their gear. The drone operators recalibrated twice. Everyone felt it, that subtle shift from looking for someone to chasing a shadow. Somewhere beyond the mapped grids and the labeled coordinates, there was another set of directions. And someone out there had just reminded them of it. By the third day, the official search maps looked more like a patchwork quilt than a clean grid. Sections were shaded in different colors. Yellow for areas cleared by ground teams, blue for drone coverage, green for where K-9s had worked. It should have been reassuring. Instead, it highlighted the void in the middle, the place where nothing fit. Deputies had gone over the marked trailhead access road twice. The dirt shoulder where Rick had parked was undisturbed except for the scuff marks left by search boots. Yet, that morning, a deputy found something odd while checking the service road that looped around to the other side of the ridge. Fresh tire tracks where there shouldn't have been any. The prints were wide and deep, from an off-road vehicle, and they cut across a strip of scrubland with no real path. The road didn't connect to any public access point, just petered out near a stand of mesquite. Whoever drove there had either known the terrain well or wasn't worried about getting stuck. The detail went into the incident log as possible unrelated, but it stuck in people's minds. The nearest private property was a half-mile away. Later that afternoon, the sheriff's office pulled the still frames from the gas station camera, the last clear footage of Rick and Melissa before the trailhead. In the corner of one shot, a vehicle was just visible at the edge of the lot. An older Ford Bronco, pale blue, with a dent in the rear quarter panel. Karen Ward was sitting with the lead detective when he showed her the frame. She leaned forward, squinting at the grainy outline, and her face tightened. "That's my ex-husband's truck," she said. The detective's pen stopped over his notepad. "You're sure?" "I'd know that dent anywhere," she said. "It happened in 2009. He never fixed it." Melissa hadn't spoken to her father in nearly 6 years. The last contact had been a birthday card with no return address. Karen hadn't known where he was living now. When deputies tracked him down, he was in Henderson, working a job at an auto parts warehouse. He didn't deny being at that gas station. Said he'd been driving through on his way to see a friend in Tonopah. He gave them a name and an address. The friend confirmed it. The timestamp put him 100 miles away when Rick and Melissa started up the trail. The alibi held, on paper. Around sunset, a man in his 50s walked into the search command post carrying a battered pair of binoculars. His jeans were dusty, his hat sweat-stained from a day in the field. He introduced himself as Frank Harlan, a hunter who had been scouting for the upcoming deer season. 2 days before the hikers vanished, he said, he'd been glassing a distant ridge when he noticed another man standing among the rocks, not dressed for hiking, no visible pack. The man wasn't looking at the view. He was looking downslope, through binoculars, toward the lower trail where 2 people were walking. Frank couldn't make out their faces from that distance, but the body language was clear. One was taller, one shorter, moving at a steady pace. He figured they were just hikers. The man on the ridge, though, watched them until they disappeared into a stand of pinyon. Then he lowered his binoculars, turned, and walked away in the opposite direction. When asked if he could describe him, Frank shook his head. "Too far. Just the way he stood there, it didn't look casual. It looked like he was waiting on something." The next morning, a search team on the east side of the range stumbled on something not marked on any recent map. A small cabin, weathered to gray, half hidden in a fold of the hillside. From the outside, it looked abandoned, roof sagging, windows clouded with dust. But the front door had a new brass padlock, the kind you buy at a hardware store for $20. The shackle was clean, no rust, no dust, no sign it had been there long. The lead on that team radioed it in, and deputies hiked up to secure the site. They didn't force entry, not without a warrant, but they photographed the lock, the door frame, the boot prints in the dust around the porch. The prints were sharp, unweathered, pointing toward the door and back down the slope. When those photos hit the incident room, the tension in the air sharpened. It wasn't just that a locked cabin had turned up in the search area. It was that no one in the county office could say who owned it, or why it wasn't on the property rolls at all. Back at the trailhead, the wind picked up, scattering grit across the hoods of the parked trucks. The mountains beyond seemed the same as they had the morning Rick and Melissa stepped into them. Silent, sunlit, indifferent. But now, the neat lines on the map had started to unravel. There were tracks where there shouldn't be tracks. A face from the past in the same gas station frame. A stranger with binoculars on a ridge. And, waiting in the rocks, a cabin with a lock that didn't match its age. Somewhere between those details was the shape of what happened. They just hadn't seen it clearly yet. If this story touched you, even a little, let me know in the comments. We read them all. The lock came off with one hard swing of a Halligan. The sound cracked across the slope, scattering a pair of J's from the pinion above. Deputies pushed the door open, flashlights cutting into the gloom. The air inside was stale, layered with the smell of dust, dry wood, and something faintly sour. Old fabric, maybe, or damp paper. Footprints from the entry team printed fresh into a surface of fine gray powder. The walls were unpainted planks, warped slightly from years of mountain weather. The first impression was that the place had been empty for years, but the table in the center told a different story. On its scarred surface sat a sealed grocery bag and a plastic bottle of water. The label on the bottle gleamed under the flashlight. Production date stamped in black ink. Only 7 days old. The bag held a loaf of bread, a can of chili, a vacuum-sealed pack of jerky. All in date, all recently purchased. The bread still had the faint elasticity of the factory, not yet gone to staleness in the mountain air. In the far corner, under an army blanket that had discolored to a uniform brown, one of the deputies found a shoe. A single trail runner, size 12. The fabric was clean, the tread unworn. Rick's make and model. The same pair his friends had seen him lace up at the trailhead. It looked as though someone had placed it there deliberately, not discarded. No dust, no damp, no sign of weathering. The deputy turned it over in his gloved hands, then sealed it in an evidence bag. They cleared the rest of the cabin. One small cot against the wall, mattress sunken and covered in a layer of grit. A cold fireplace with ash so fine it must have been from a fire years ago. Cupboards empty except for a dented tin mug and a melted candle stub. But the contrast stuck. The fresh food, the clean shoe, inside a place that otherwise seemed untouched for decades. Back at the incident post, they sent the grocery items for trace. Within a day, the results came back. The bread and jerky had been bought at a supermarket in Las Vegas, 2 days before the cabin search. Paid in cash. The receipt had no loyalty number, no credit card, no way to identify the buyer. The location of the store was nowhere near Rick's or Melissa's known routes that week, which meant someone had gone out of their way to shop there, then hauled the goods into the mountains. Theories flared and died just as quickly. If Rick or Melissa had been in that cabin, why would they leave without the supplies? If someone else left it for them, why not take the shoe? And why leave a shoe at all? Near the end of the sweep, a deputy checking a warped dresser in the corner found a single sheet of lined paper folded into quarters. The fold lines were sharp, the ink unbled. 3 words in block letters, written by hand. Don't trust police. The writing leaned slightly to the right, heavy on the downstrokes, as if pressed by someone used to carving their words into the page. No signature, no date, no other marks. The paper was bagged and logged. But when the lead investigator glanced at it, his mouth tightened. The phrase could mean anything or nothing. In the context of missing people, it meant trouble. That night, Karen Ward sat in the sheriff's office, staring at the photo of the note. She wanted it to be a prank, a planted piece of nothing to throw the search off. But the shoe, the food, the water, those weren't nothing. Those were signs of life, or signs of someone wanting the searchers to think so. Outside, the mountains went dark against a sky pricked with stars. The cabin door had been resecured with a temporary lock, the evidence removed, the footprint patterns inside already committing themselves to memory in the minds of everyone who'd seen them. And in the space between the official theory and the unspoken suspicion, a new possibility was taking shape. That Rick and Melissa had been in those hills after the world thought they were gone. The first break didn't come from a map or a lab. It came from a man who drove people where the asphalt ended. His name was Dale Foster, mid-40s, the kind of local who knew every washboard mile between Pahrump and the state line. He guided tourists to trailheads when rental sedans couldn't make it, hauled mountain bikers out when they pinched a tire 30 miles from help, and kept a styrofoam cooler in the back seat, stocked with water and sun-faded granola bars. He walked into the sheriff's office 2 weeks after the cabin search, hat in hand, and asked to talk to whoever was in charge. In the small interview room, he sat forward with his forearms on the table and described a late afternoon run he'd made 3 days after the official disappearance date. He'd been returning from a drop-off near an old quarry road when he saw a pair walking along the shoulder. A man and a woman, dusty, moving like they'd been out longer than they planned. The woman kept glancing behind them. The man had a cap pulled low. "I thought they might want a lift," he said. I slowed up, rolled the window down to ask. Before I could, they cut off into the brush. Didn't look at me, didn't wave, just gone. He remembered the woman's backpack, small, teal, and the way she held her shoulders tight, like she was bracing for a second impact no one else could see. When he heard later about the missing hikers, his stomach went cold. He checked the date on his logbook twice before he came in. The detective took notes, thanked him, and promised to follow up. The official summary that made it into the incident file the next day was drier. Driver reports possible sighting of couple matching general description. Subjective, not corroborated. When the family asked about it, the sheriff's spokesperson said the same thing on camera that he said off it. People often misremember faces, especially when their minds fill in gaps from the news. He pointed to the number of false sightings they'd already logged. Couples on trails, pairs at gas stations, a woman in teal at a farmer's market. "We have to prioritize leads that align with the timeline and physical evidence," he said. Karen felt something inside her harden at that. To her, Dale's details didn't sound like a story someone invented. They sounded like someone who'd spent years reading roads and people and knew when a pair didn't want to be seen. She didn't yell at the press conference. She went home and called a number she'd been given on a folded slip of paper weeks earlier. The private investigator arrived the next morning in a sun-cracked sedan with a laptop bag and the kind of patience born of too many hours spent staring at screens. Her name was Nora Pike. She'd worked missing persons out of Phoenix before going on her own. She sat up at Karen's kitchen table with coffee and a stack of non-disclosure forms no one bothered to read, then asked for every login, every email address, and permission to look where families usually didn't want strangers to look. Nora didn't walk the ridge or the canyon. She walked the internet. She pulled metadata off Melissa's public posts, then pivoted to the accounts of hiking friends, old co-workers, and the strangers who had tagged the same trailheads that week. She scraped group photos from tourist companies in 3 states and ran them through a face clustering tool that sorted images by proximity of features: jawline, brow angle, ear shape. She didn't trust the software. She trusted the patterns it revealed. 3 weeks into the case, at 2 in the morning, she texted Karen a single image. It was a promotional photo from a rafting outfitter in southern Utah, taken 3 months after Rick and Melissa vanished. A dozen clients grinned at the camera in mismatched life vests, sunburned and happy. In the far left of the frame, half hidden behind a man raising his paddle, a woman stood a step back from the group. Ball cap, sunglasses. Head turned away at the last second, as if she'd seen something and moved. The face was a slice, not a full view, but the mouth, the shape of it when at rest, was wrong to be a coincidence. Nora didn't send opinion. She sent a side-by-side, scaled and leveled, with the landmark's eyes follow even when software falters. The asymmetry in the top lip, the way the left ear lobe sits closer to the jaw. A small crescent scar at the edge of the eyebrow you'd miss unless you were looking for it. Karen stared until the 2 images began to flicker into one. The deputies who reviewed it said what they were trained to say. Resolution too low? Angle too oblique? Sunglasses obstructive? They used phrases like non-actionable resemblance and no independent verification. Karen hung up the phone very gently and then set her palm flat against the table to keep it from shaking. Nora didn't argue. She went looking for more frames from the same day. She found 3, 2 on the outfitter's Facebook page, 1 on a client's personal Instagram that the algorithm had not yet buried. In one, the woman's hand was visible at her collarbone, fingers splayed as if pressing something flat against her skin. Zoomed, the pixels fought back. The chain was only a suggestion. The charm was a blur. Nora printed it anyway and brought it to the kitchen table, where the afternoon light made the paper look almost glossy. "Look at the shape," she said. Karen didn't want to. She'd been telling herself that the pendant Melissa forgot to wear the morning she left was at home, tucked in the ceramic dish by the sink where she always left it. She'd checked 3 times since the day they disappeared, each time feeling both relieved and vaguely sick to see it there, proof of something she didn't have a name for. But the outline on the printout had its own gravity. An oval, not round, the way it sat slightly off-center on the chain, like the loop was worn. In the blown-up image, a pale highlight curved along one edge where sunlight hit metal and bounced back. "It could be any necklace," Karen said, because that was the responsible thing to say. "It could," Nora agreed. She slid another photo across, taken a second later from a slightly different angle. In it, the oval flashed again, and the chain caught at the same point where Melissa's always did. Or it could be this necklace. Karen stood and walked to the sink without seeing it, then back to the table. She opened the ceramic dish and stared at the empty ring of dust inside. When she closed her hand around nothing, her palm trembled. "It was here," she said. "I know it was here." Nora didn't answer. She was looking at the background of the rafting photo now, the scrub on the bank, the slant of rock, the signage on the guide's helmet. Things that might fix a place in time without words. She could hear the shape of the next call in her head. A tip not to the sheriff's office, but to a jurisdiction 2 states away that hadn't yet learned to dismiss this case by reflex. Before she dialed, her cursor hovered over the woman's face one more time. In the sliver of jaw and the turn of the mouth, there was a strain that didn't fit the moment. A crowd's happiness moves in a single direction. This face tugged another way, as if it had its own weather. Nora didn't write that in her report. She sent the files, documented the timestamps, and logged the coordinates she'd pulled from a forgotten EXIF tag. When she closed her laptop, the kitchen was dark. Karen sat with her hands folded, knuckles pale, looking at the printouts as if they might yield sound if she stared long enough. In the silence, the refrigerator kicked on, a small domestic engine refusing, bravely, to read the room. On the table between them lay 2 facts that didn't touch, but refused to move. A driver who saw a pair step off the road when help arrived, and a woman 3 months later wearing an oval of silver that should have been sitting beside a sink in Nevada. The line between those points wasn't yet a road. It was a path only visible if you turned your head just so, like catching a glint of metal in sun and deciding whether to believe your own eyes. The letters had been folded into plain envelopes with no return address, no stamps, no postmarks, just slipped into Melissa's apartment mailbox sometime in the weeks before the hike. They were short, no more than 3 lines each, written in tidy block print on heavy paper. The real trails aren't on the maps. Come where no one turns back. The only way forward is without return. Melissa's roommate at the time, a nurse named Tasha, found the stack in a drawer when she went to water the plants after the disappearance. She thought they were some kind of outdoor brand's guerrilla marketing, the kind of cryptic ad campaign that ends up as a YouTube reveal. She mentioned them in passing to Karen during the 2nd week of searches, but no one took it further. By the time Nora asked about them, the envelopes were gone. Karen swore they had been in Melissa's apartment. Tasha swore the same. Neither could explain how they vanished. 2 nights after that revelation, Karen got another call. This one from Jake Ward, Rick's younger brother. His voice was tight, like it had been wound around a nail. "There's something I didn't tell the cops," he said. The night before the hike, Rick had called him out of the blue. They hadn't talked in months. Rick's tone was level, but the words had weight. "If something happens," he'd said, "look in the notebook in my garage." He didn't explain. He didn't joke the way he usually did. He just repeated it once and hung up. Jake had meant to check the next day, but then the news hit, and the garage became part of the search perimeter. By the time Jake tried to get in, the door was padlocked under police seal. When the warrant cleared and the family was allowed to reclaim Rick's belongings, the notebook was gone. No one on the search team remembered seeing one. The shelves were dust-marked where boxes had been shifted, but there was no gap the right size for a spiral-bound anything. Nora's research turned up something else, not from this year, but from the past decade. There were 2 other disappearance reports tied to the same stretch of backcountry. Both hikers, both in their 30s, both vanishing without trace. The first was a solo trekker in 2011, last seen at a trailhead 15 miles north of where Rick and Melissa parked. His car was found locked, keys inside. The second, a couple in 2016, went missing on a day hike. Their packs were discovered leaning against a juniper, food still inside. Neither case had a resolution. The files had been closed as unresolved missing persons, with no further public comment. When Nora cross-referenced the search areas, she noticed that all 3, 2011, 2016, and now 2020, overlapped in a band of terrain west of the official maps, A tangle of arroyos and dry creek beds the search teams avoided because GPS coverage there was unreliable. The email came in just after midnight. No sender name, no subject line. An attachment labeled simply .mp4. Nora scanned it twice for embedded malware before opening. The file was grainy, black and white, the telltale bloom of infrared from a trail camera. The date stamp in the corner read 14 months after the day Rick and Melissa were declared missing. Two figures moved through the frame, side by side on a narrow mountain path. The man's shoulders sloped the same way Rick's did when he was tired. The woman's gait was short, deliberate, like Melissa's after long descents. Their faces were pale ovals in the IR, impossible to make out. The woman carried no pack. The man's pack looked too full for a short hike. The most chilling detail wasn't their appearance. It was the way they moved. Not like people lost, but like people who knew exactly where they were going. At the bottom edge of the frame, for a fraction of a second, a third shape appeared, smaller, hunched, following. Its proportions were off, as if the lens had caught it mid-step. Before Nora could freeze it cleanly, the clip ended. She called Karen before dawn. They sat in the same kitchen as when the rafting photo appeared, but this time no one pretended to sip coffee. The video looped again and again on Nora's screen. "If that's them," Karen said, voice rough, "then where have they been for a year?" Nora didn't answer. She was looking past the figures now, into the dim wash of the IR against the rock wall behind them. Faintly, almost lost to the light bloom, there were markings, vertical lines, some curved, some slashed. She froze the frame and enlarged it until the pixels threatened to break apart. They weren't random scrapes. They were letters. Karen leaned closer, breathing through her nose like she was afraid to touch the image. It wasn't a word. It was a date. The year was 2016. That number sat between them, colder than the mountain night. It matched the year of the last disappearance. And somewhere, if the timestamp on the video was to be believed, Rick and Melissa had walked right past it, 14 months after they were supposed to be gone. The email had no sender to trace, no IP that didn't lead to dead ends. But someone wanted them to see this. Someone wanted them to know that the missing didn't just vanish into air. They walked paths no one else followed, and maybe they were still walking. Nora took the long way on purpose. No marked trailheads, no cameras at the kiosk, no chance encounter with a ranger who'd be obligated to radio it in. She left her car before dawn, where the dirt road pinched into scrub, and walked by headlamp until the sky turned the color of unripe peaches. The air had that desert-clean smell, dust that hadn't been touched yet, creosote waking up, while the spring mountains stood off to the west, pale and cold and pretending innocence. The canyon locals talked about wasn't on any current map. Miners had cut into it decades ago and left when the price dropped, taking the rails and leaving the holes. Hunters called it the Notch. If you found the wash with the split cottonwood and followed the dry bed until the stone began to rise, the land would break open and the temperature would fall like a stairwell to another season. She reached the mouth just after 8. A faint breeze pushed cool air out from underground, smelling like wet rock and something metallic, old blood in a cut that never quite heals. The entrance wasn't a dramatic cave, just a seam in the cliff where timbers still braced a horizontal shaft, gray with age and furred with lichen. Someone had tacked a rusted "Keep Out" sign to a post years back. It swung on one nail, clicking when the breeze shifted. The sheriff had told her to stay away from this zone until a new warrant was written. She'd nodded and then opened an old topo and found another way in. She wasn't a cop. She had rules, but they were hers. Inside, the light went flat. Her headlamp took over, the beam catching motes of dust that flowed like slow snow. She stepped carefully, heel to toe, testing ground that had been undermined before most of the current town was born. The shaft ran straight, and then bent left, following a vein. The air cooled with every yard, a steady exhale from the stone. Far back, she heard water, or thought she did. A drip that took its time. The first sign was a scuff, new against old, not animal. The pattern read like modern rubber, not century-old boots. 10 more yards brought her to a wider chamber, where the roof rose and the timbers doubled. On the right wall, at shoulder height, the lamp found shallow cuts, raw against the older scratches. R and MA plus sign between. Below, a date, 5 months after the official disappearance. The letters were crude, carved with something dull. A key or a screw, maybe. The stone around them was fresher than the rest, powdery where the tip had chewed. Nora reached out, but didn't touch. She let the light make the contact. She took photos with her phone, and then with the small Nikon she trusted when seconds mattered, angling the beam to pull the shadows out of the grooves. Her throat felt tight in that room without her understanding why. The camp was deeper in, if camp was the word. A circle of blackened stones that didn't match the surrounding rock sat against the far wall where smoke might have found its way out through seams. The ash in the middle had 2 ages, an old layer, compacted, and, on top, a scatter that still held shape. A twist of char clung to a stick, not entirely consumed. Someone had kept the flame small and mean, the way you do when you can't afford to be seen. A dented enamel mug lay on its side near the fire ring, its rim scorched, a patch of blue still clinging to the outside like a bruise. She picked it up with a glove and tipped it so the beam could interrogate the interior. At the bottom, caught in a varnish of soot, something flashed dull silver. She steadied the light and felt her stomach go cold. It was a dental filling, small, irregular, a cusp of molars still stained, a color teeth shouldn't be outside a mouth. It had been in heat. The metal showed a slight flow at one edge. She put the mug down gently and took photos, then bagged it, sealing the plastic with hands that wanted to shake and would not. On a flat rock near the ash lay other small proofs. A torn corner of a foil food packet, a strip of duct tape feathered at the end where it had been ripped without a knife, the green head of a match with the wood burned clean to black. Above the pit, hammered into a timber with deliberate care, hung a length of wire hook, not original to the mine, newish without rust, for hanging something off the ground, a kettle, a lantern, or a bag you didn't want rats in. The questions came at light speed and then slowed to a crawl because the answers didn't want to be born. If Rick and Melissa were here 5 months after they were supposed to be gone, were they hiding or hidden? If they had fire, did they have air? If they carved their initials, were they leaving proof for someone or for themselves? Nora stood still until she could hear her own breathing again. The shaft creaked once, the way old places sigh when a day heats and cools. She traced the beam along the floor. A rectangle of packed earth made a human shape more by absence than by outline. A place where someone had slept in rotations long enough to teach the ground to remember them. Near it, the imprint of another body, smaller or curled tighter. The 2 divots almost touched. She found no bottles, no wrappers large enough to carry a barcode, no personal item with a name. Whoever had been here understood how things tell on you. Or whoever made them stay knew. For the first time since stepping in, she felt not watched exactly, but considered. As if the space itself was thinking about the best way to close its mouth. She backed toward the junction, turned once to look at the initials again, and shot another series of photos from a lower angle. The date at the bottom of the carving sat like a dare. She remembered the trail cam clip, the way the figures moved as if they recognized every bend in the dark. Hiding in plain contempt of the search above, or driven in here by something worse than exposure. She crouched to the fire ring again, scanned the ash one last time, and stared at the filling until the image burned into her. She'd need it later, when someone said none of this could have happened the way it obviously had. The thought she'd been refusing finally stepped forward. Alive, 5 months in, meant choices. Not just theirs. She killed the lamp and listened. The dark arrived all at once, complete, the kind that has weight. The mind spoke in its own language. Distant drips, a low wooden groan as a beam adjusted, the whisper of air sneaking around a corner somewhere out of sight. She counted to 10, then 20, then reached for the switch. Before her thumb found it, the sound came. A light metallic ding, pure, like something thin and hollow being struck once. She froze. It hadn't come from the room she was in. It hadn't come from the way she'd walked. It was ahead, down where the shaft curved right into the belly of the hill. She turned the lamp back on in a tight cone and kept it low to the ground so the beam wouldn't announce her. The ding didn't repeat. The drip resumed its lazy counting, and a small wind found her face and left again. No animals made that sound, not in that way, not with intent. She set the mug back where she'd found it and slid the bag into her pack, the plastic making the quiet loud. The urge to call out rose like heat under a closed door and then went down, because what would she say, and to whom? She stepped backward, heel to toe, until the wall on her left gave her shoulder. At the junction she paused, angled her lamp at the initials one last time, and took in the fact that names are a kind of resistance. The ding came again, softer now, like a testing of distance. Nora didn't run, but she didn't linger to learn the third note. She slipped out toward the pale wedge of daylight and felt the temperature climb back up her arms. At the mouth, the keep out sign clicked once in the new wind. Innocent and obvious as a warning, you only understand after you ignore it. Nora didn't let herself run until the daylight narrowed to a blade. Even then, she kept her steps measured, lamp low, breath in her throat, the way you do when sound could be an address. Outside, the air felt new and thin. She killed the beam and let her eyes adjust. The canyon held the morning like a cooled forge, stone radiating heat left from yesterday, shade pooling where the walls pinched tight. Somewhere above, a jay scolded the emptiness for existing. She cut back along the wash, boots finding the pale line where water had once taught feet to go. The farther she got from the seam of the mine, the less her brain tried to assign meaning to small noises. A pebble skittering back to where it belonged, a twig pushing up after being stepped on. Her pulse needed a geography lesson. Halfway to the lip, the cottonwoods gathered, their leaves talking to each other in a metallic whisper. That's where he stepped out. He wasn't a jump scare. He was a slow arrival, a shape deciding to be a man. Tall the way age makes you taller by subtracting flesh. Canvas jacket, sweat dark hat, hands like rope. He planted his walking stick and waited until she stopped 10 feet away. "You shouldn't be down there," he said. His voice had the dry carry of someone who had spoken to more wind than people. "I was never here," Nora said, "because it's what people like her say. Because it buys you seconds while your heart learns a smaller beat." He nodded once, amused without smiling. "You're looking for Melissa." Her name in a stranger's mouth felt like a door opening the wrong way. Nora's fingers slid inside her pocket and found the corner of the evidence bag. You knew her? He looked past her shoulder, toward the seam in the rock. You learn names when folks are hiding under yours, he said. She didn't want to be found. The words fell between them, light as ash. Nora kept still. Why? He rubbed his thumb across a callus on his palm, thinking how much to say. Sometimes the thing that comes with rescue is worse than what you're running from. Police? Nora asked. He blew air through his nose. Bad men wear all kinds of coats. Some carry badges. Some carry wrenches. Some carry nothing at all and let other men do the carrying. He shifted the stick, pointed with his chin down canyon. You tell your people to stop walking in lines. Lines are for being watched. If you want to know where they went, watch where the birds don't sit. What's your name? She asked. Somebody else's, most days, he said. And then he was already the color of the trees again, edges softening until the canyon took him back. She stood there a long beat, listening for the metallic ding she'd left behind. It didn't follow. When her hands stopped shaking, she moved. By afternoon, the mine had a file number. The sheriff didn't ask how Nora found it. He asked why she hadn't called him first. She didn't answer that one. Instead, she laid out the photos. The initials, the date 5 months after the day the search had been called Recovery, the ash with 2 ages, the enamel mug with the small, indecent shine at the bottom. The room took a breath and didn't give it back. An hour later, they weren't in the sheriff's office anymore. They were in a windowless conference room at the county building that smelled like copier heat and old coffee. 2 men from the U.S. Marshal's Service sat across from the local brass, ties loosened, but not enough to suggest comfort. A woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office set a folder on the table like a clock. Under seal, she said, and then broke it with a fingernail. The admission didn't come as a speech. It bled out in disclaimers and jurisdictional verbs. Rick and Melissa had been scheduled to testify in a federal case tied to interstate theft and 2 homicides. They had given statements. They had sat in rooms with a camera that did not have tape over its red eye. They had been placed into protective relocation pending trial. And then they were gone. Transferred, one marshal said carefully. There was an issue during movement, a miscommunication. Which is when they disappeared, Nora said. He didn't disagree. He didn't agree. Why didn't you tell the family? Karen asked. She had a paper cup of water she hadn't touched. It had left a ring on the table. The U.S. Attorney's mouth thinned. We couldn't risk compromising the case. They're compromised, Karen said, soft enough to cut. The marshals talked about options and witness protection protocols and how people make choices under pressure that don't look like choices from the outside. They did not talk about a mine or initials carved at shoulder height or a filling fused into a mug. That evening, Jake Ward opened a box in his garage he hadn't touched in years. It lived under a workbench behind a coil of extension cord, marked in his own handwriting. Rick, Misk, Tools, Maps. He would tell Nora later that he didn't know what made him look there. He just did. Inside, beneath a stack of folded topo pages and a bag of mismatched nuts and bolts, lay an envelope with his name and nothing else. The postmark was from a year ago. The return address space was blank. The handwriting on the front made his hands forget how to hold. He sat on the concrete and opened it with a pocket knife he kept too sharp. One sheet of paper, ruled, torn from a cheap pad. Rick's block print, pressed hard. No greeting. Everything isn't what you think. We chose the quiet. Forgive me for the way this looks from where you are. No signature. No explanation who's quiet and whose choice. The paper smelled like the inside of a glove compartment. Plastic. Sun. Jake's breath went thin. He called Karen. He called Nora. He said he didn't know whether to be furious or grateful or both. He said he didn't know which answer would let him sleep. The call from the lab came after midnight, when rooms with fluorescent lights say too much about the people who stay in them. The trail cam video Nora had received anonymously. The metadata was dirty, but the engineers were better. They pulled a clock from the sensor that didn't lie. The clip had been recorded 1 week before 2 hikers found skeletal remains in a wash below the ridge and called it in. The official narrative didn't have a pocket for that. The sheriff said they would wait for dental. The marshals said they couldn't comment on an ongoing federal investigation. The U.S. attorney said the word alleged so many times it stopped meaning anything. Nora watched the video again, frame by frame. The third shape at the bottom edge still refused to resolve into a person-sized certainty. The letters scratched into the rock behind the figures still spelled a date from years earlier. The woman still pressed her hand to her collarbone as if to hold something small and oval and silver in place. When the lab finished the first pass on the bones, the town exhaled a terrible kind of relief. The preliminary report said the remains were consistent with 1 adult male and 1 adult female. The press release wrote the names in pencil. Nora didn't go to the vigil outside the courthouse. She drove to the edge of town, where the skyline turned to blocky dark and the mesquite-shaded lots became space. She rolled down the window and let the night in, creosote and diesel and the thin, clean smell of mountains that had always been there before people started keeping track. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You're late." She stared at it until the screen went black, and she could see her own face in it, unfamiliar in the glass. When she looked up, a freight train was moving along the horizon, its headlight drawing a white seam through the desert. The horn blew once, long, and the gate bell counted itself down to silence. Somewhere beyond that line, a mine held initials that hadn't asked permission to be carved. Somewhere else, a family held a letter that said, "We chose the quiet." Between those points, the story the officials were telling began to unspool. Nora turned the car around. In the rear view, the town's lights gathered themselves and pretended to be one thing. The road back to the sheriff's office felt longer than it should, a stretch of black that made room for only one thought at a time. If the video was a week old, and the bones had been found today, then either time was playing a trick, or someone was. She didn't know yet which was worse. The final report came in under a thicker cover than usual, a manila jacket with the words, "Evidence, do not release," stamped in red. The sheriff didn't open it in the squad room. He took it into his office, shut the blinds, and called only Nora and Jake inside. The air felt weighted, like the moments before a storm breaks. He didn't waste time. "DNA confirms the male remains are Rick's," he said. His voice didn't climb or dip. It just sat there, heavy. "The second set," he hesitated, eyes moving between them, "is not Melissa." Jake blinked, as if he'd misheard. "Then who?" The sheriff slid a photo from the folder. It showed a grayed skull on a canvas sheet, tagged. Below it, a name neither of them recognized. A woman in her 40s who'd been missing since 2008. A case abandoned in another state. No connection to Melissa. No reason to be in these mountains. Except that she'd died here. The sheriff leaned back, as though distance could make the fact smaller. "As far as the state's concerned, Rick's gone. Melissa's status stays missing." The word "missing" did nothing to make it real. By late afternoon, the press release had gone out. Remains identified. Case closed. A tidy story. 2 hikers. Tragic accident. nature reclaiming what it takes. No mention of the mine or the initials or the year-old video clip. Nora didn't go to the courthouse steps where locals lit candles for closure. She stayed in her office, blinds drawn, watching the same 20 seconds of grainy footage she'd been given months ago. The tall figure in the lead, the shorter one glancing back at the camera as if she knew it was there. The shape of her hand rising to her collarbone, the unmistakable glint of silver. Her phone buzzed. No number. No text. Just a delivery notice. Parcel left at your door. On her porch sat a small cardboard box. No return address. Postmarked from 3 towns over. The tape was neatly cut, not torn, as if someone wanted her to open it quickly. Inside, cushioned by a layer of old newspaper, was a single object. The silver pendant Melissa's mother had sworn was left on the dresser the morning she vanished. Its chain was tangled, but the clasp still worked. Beneath it, a thin plastic case, an SD card scuffed at the edges. No label. Nora set it in her laptop's slot. The file tree held only one clip, time-stamped 2 weeks ago. She clicked. The screen filled with a slow, shaking image. A ridgeline at dusk, wind pulling at the mic. The camera was moving uphill, catching flashes of boot tips in the bottom of the frame. For nearly a minute, there was only that sound, steps and wind. Then the lens tipped sideways, showing a woman's profile in the failing light. Hair longer now, darker at the ends, face sharper. But it was her. Melissa. She looked straight into the camera, lips parted as if to start and stop a sentence. She leaned close enough that her breath fogged the lens. Her voice was a whisper so soft it seemed to come from inside the listener's ear. "Don't look for me." The clip ended there. No fade, no static, just black. Nora sat back, pulse climbing in the silence. The sheriff's case-closed notice was still open on her desktop. She clicked it shut. Across town, Jake's phone rang. No caller ID. When he answered, there was no voice, only the hollow rush of wind and what might have been footsteps moving away. That night, Karen called Nora in a hushed panic. She'd woken to the sound of something scratching at her front door. When she looked, the porch was empty, but sitting on the doormat was a small, mud-streaked stuffed animal. A toy mountain goat Melissa used to carry on hikes when she was a kid. No one could explain how it got there. The official file stayed sealed. The press moved on. The locals folded the story into the same drawer where they kept old ghost tales. Something you didn't bring up unless you wanted to scare someone new to town. But Nora kept the pendant in her desk drawer, the SD card beside it. Some nights she'd take them out and set them on the blotter, as if the proximity might force the truth to blink. In the mountains, the wind still carried down the canyons in long, low tones, the kind that sound too much like voices. And on certain trails, if you walked far enough without speaking, you might notice the birds had gone silent, and the only sound left was your own breathing, steady, deliberate, like someone just ahead of you, choosing not to turn around.